Hello and welcome to the ManageIQ Sprint 159 review. This was a regular 2-week sprint, but it was the only thing irregular about it was that a number of us were transitioning from Red Hat to IBM. So as always, I will provide the overview. Kavya will update us on the UI, Adam on the providers, and then Jason will update us on the platform, the API, and the developer. So this sprint, we had a drop back to the number of pull requests opened and merged, back down to sprint 157 levels. I'm attributing this to the fact of what I mentioned before, that we're transitioning from Red Hat to IBM. Hopefully, as we get up to speed at IBM, these numbers will start moving back up as they always have. In terms of the distribution of the merged PRs, 38 were bugs, 22 were enhancements, and 19 were refactorings. And I think that's the overview. And with that, I will turn over to Kavya.
Hey, thanks, Oleg. Hey, good morning, everyone. There were 13 PRs that got merged across UI repos. There were 9 bugs, 1 enhancement, and so on. Below, you see some of the important PRs out of 13. So next slide, please. Here, this is an enhancement and part of converting Explorer screens to non-Explorer. Before it was, providers were part of Ansible Tower Explorer, and after that it was added to left nav directly. Next slide, please. Fixed a bug about missing breadcrumbs in add and edit screens of both policy and policy profiles. Next screen, please. Here, fixed a bug in search where we enter large numbers in UI and UI is hanging up. Now it is fixed. For more information, you can check the PR. Next slide, please. Here, fixed a bug related to saving chargeback report. Earlier, tag and group by tag values are not at all saving. Now with this PR, it is working as expected. Next slide, please. This is one of the important PRs that got merged into a last sprint, but we didn't have UI demo in last call, so I'm just covering that now. Here, we moved leftover components in React UI components to UI Classic. So except in UI Classic, these components are not being used in any other repo. So with this change, we completely remove the package dependency, React UI components package dependency in the package.json of UI Classic. Next slide, please. So just following up with the same PR, one of the issue that fixed as part of this is in table summary page, all the clickable links are differentiated by color now. Earlier, color is only visible when we hover on those rows, but it is now visible without even hovering. So this improves both usability and accessibility of this page. Now that's all on UI. Now with that, over to Adam.
Thank you, Kavya.
Thanks, Kavya. All right, so for providers this sprint, on core, we made some changes to update to the combined manager refresh pattern. This reduces the overhead on the queue to only a single item per refresh for all of the parent managers and child managers. In some cases, we removed some extra workers. So for example, on Google, there was an extra network manager refresh worker that we now collapsed into the main parent manager refresh worker. And in a lot of cases, it actually reduces the number of API calls that we have to make out to the provider because there are some cross-linking going on between the network manager and the cloud manager. So in some cases, they're doing collections in both, unfortunately. So now with the combined pattern, it's just generally simpler and better performance overall. So this sprint, we added that pattern to the generator. So now if you generate a new provider, you'll automatically get that pattern. And we converted over Azure and Google to this pattern in addition to IBM and Oracle, which were already following this. So there are still a few to go. I think there are about 4, getting down to the ones that are trickier to move over now. Also, we added pluggable secrets for providers. So let me see if I can mute Slack here. Sorry. So now, previously, there was a single secrets file in the core repo, and you had to kind of add whatever providers you had to that. Now you can have a file in each of your provider repos. So it made it a lot simpler to deal with secrets that you need for your VCR specs. It also gives the provider author more control over how the renaming of the secrets are happening. So for example, a lot of host names, there's a lot of special handling around that because the way that we did the uppercase wasn't a valid URI. So a bunch of providers had to have their own extra logic to make those valid URIs. And that all got cleaned up, and now they can control the names of the different secrets and how they get converted. Next slide, please. In addition to this, we improved the performance of the authentication check method. So a bunch of cloud providers, namely Amazon, Azure, and OpenStack, collect SSH key pairs from the provider as part of inventory. Those get saved in the authentications table along with all of the other provider credentials which are used to connect to the API. The difference being that there's an auth type on the credentials which are intended to be used to connect to the API. When we were doing an authentication check, we were looping through all of these, in some cases, many thousands of them. And so the CPU overhead on the orchestrator doing the authentication check valid was significantly higher. So now we're doing a simple query to check to see if the auth type is nil or not, to only look at credentials which are intended to be used for connecting to the provider API. For Ansible Tower, we fixed an issue where the API path was no longer being automatically added to the URL. Previously, a user would only have to enter the base URL, and we would automatically append the API v1 or v2, whatever the case is. But as some of the DDF changes broke this functionality, so we added it back. For IBM Cloud Virtual Systems, they fixed the creation of cloud volumes. There was an issue in the way that the size was being handled. We were passing in a float, I believe, and it was expecting a straight integer. Next slide. So we got some enhancements from our community members for the NSXT provider. So they added shared network services, security groups, and destination excluded and source excluding source policy rules. So that was a nice set of enhancements from them. OpenStack was all about bug fixes this sprint. So we fixed a bug where the port was always being used as 5000, which is the default non-SSL port. So this would work fine as long as you had that port open. But if it was closed, nothing, you couldn't override it. You couldn't put in 13,000 or whatever the SSL port was. So we fixed that. There was also an issue where if you're detecting services, there are different types of errors that could be raised by different versions of OpenStack. We were only catching one of them. So when we were expecting to check if a service existed and return nil if it didn't, it was actually raising the error all the way up and failing the refresh. There's also a bug we found when working with Power VC where there was no tenant named admin. When we go to detect the tenant name that we should use, it was only ever working if you had a tenant named admin. It wouldn't actually go through and check anything else. We also fixed a couple of DDF parameter mismatches that were introduced with the DDF changes that were causing potentially the provider validation screen to, when you went to add or edit it, it would succeed, but then it would fail later and refreshes wouldn't run, which is super confusing for users. And let's see, next slide. I forget if we have one more or not. Nope, that's it. Over to Jason.
All right, on the platform side, we had a number of bugs and enhancements, and these are the highlights. Keenan worked on regex event detection. So this is part of a bigger effort to get rid of non-JSON convertible values from our settings. Regexes were stored as Ruby regexes in the settings, so they can't be presented in the UI. And this changes the event regexes to strings. And Brandon added a dependency on the Kafka package to our RPM builds. I believe this wraps up the Kafka work that Joe V was working on. And so now Kafka should be available for us to start using to do some of the other features that we want to do on the roadmap. On the bug side, Brandon fixed an issue where Kubernetes labels were generated incorrectly when that were based on zone names that had unsafe characters in them. So he fixed that to replace them with the hyphen character. As Adam said, he improved the provider check for authentication status. He also worked on an issue where when we talked to Kafka, the username and password in particular, the key names were not being set correctly. So in order to keep the interface the same, he changes them on the back end to the correct parameter names, which allows you to talk to Kafka accurately. Nick worked on an issue where the generic mount session, the unmount method was broken a while ago, and he fixed that up. And Brandon worked on a couple issues with the pods where the orchestrator image and the worker image environment variables were not being updated during reconciliation of the CR. Next slide, please. On the documentation side, there was a number of cleanups and deletions. Dan removed the duplicate authentication and API docs that we had. We're only using one of them and the other one wasn't being updated. So to clean that up, he fixed that up. And then Kavya and Adam worked on cleaning up some of the capabilities matrix, fixing some values, and then Adam removed the discovery providers feature, which we actually removed from the UI some time ago, but now we removed it from the documentation as well. Next slide, please. On the API side, Nick added more or updated Lucy's PR, and we got that over the finish line to add some endpoints for cloud subnets. He added post, patch, post, put, and delete, I believe, to the endpoint for cloud subnets. And here's an example request for the create action to API cloud subnets. Next slide, please. Iskander added import action to cloud templates. This allows you to import one image to another from one source provider to a destination provider. So you give the provider ID and the image ID that you want to import and the target provider ID or the destination provider ID. This is an example request response for that API. Next slide, please. And finally, Adam fixed a bug with the retire action on VMs. There was retire and request retire. We deprecated retire a while ago. Turned out the API was breaking. So we made retire, the current retire action, act like the request retire action. So you can pass either one and they'll do the same thing, the correct thing. Next slide, please. And finally, on the developer side, Adam wrote a guide for writing a new provider from scratch. And he'll be continuing to keep this up to date. So if you're interested in writing a new provider, this guide can help you out. It walks you through running the provider generator. And then the changes you'll need to make to the provider code that was generated in order to get your an initial inventory PR working. I think he has some more work to do with some metrics and events, so keep your eyes peeled for this one. And that's it.
All right. Next sprint will be in 2 weeks. It'll actually be sprint 160, not 159 as the slide shows. It'll be at the same time, and it will be on this same Zoom session that we're on now, that I linked, put a link there on the bottom. And with that, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank the contributors. I want to thank the presenters and the whole community. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Thanks, everyone.